and Creative Technology to deliver a lecture entitled Is There Too Much Culture? In an event hosted by Matthew Sweet.
Thank you. Welcome to Fact in Liverpool, where, as part of the Free Thinking Festival, the film director Mike Figgis is here to ask whether there is too much culture. If the answer is yes, then perhaps he can take some of the blame. He began his creative career in experimental theatre with the People Show and the Mike Figgis Group, but he's best known as a prolific director of feature films. He scored a great hit with Leaving Las Vegas. He marshalled a gang of stars in the four-way split-screen experiment Time Code. He threw Wesley Snipes and Natasha Kinski into bed in One Night Stand, and, in the spirit of Dennis Waterman, also composed the theme tune and performed the theme tune. But as well as having this crowded back catalogue, Mike Figgis has done his best to encourage other filmmakers to be equally prolific. He's designed a simple and very portable camera rig which aids shooting with a handheld digital camera. He conducts workshops in which the participants get together to learn cinematic technique. And he made a very good and very tricksy film about that called Coma, which depicted them all doing so in Slovenia. And last year he published a pocket-sized guide on how to shoot a movie if you've got more love than money. There can be few people who've done more to create the conditions under which we might all become filmmakers, or at least get to the stage at which we might discover that we're not as good at it as he is. Strange, then, that he's come here to talk about the problems of cultural overproduction, to suggest that there is too much culture. Mike Figgis, the floor is yours.
I wrote 12 pages of notes, and I've left them in the car. I probably wouldn't have looked at them anyway because I get too confused. So what I've done is I've put together a few ideas which aren't necessarily first cousins, but in my mind there's a sort of instinctive relationship between all of them. And it's something I've thought about a lot, mainly because, if you try and produce anything these days, you immediately come up against a large number of problems about how can you find your audience, basically. So I'm not saying, get rid of culture. I'm just saying there's too much of it. And what I'm going to talk about now is my thought process over the last years as to how this has come about. The question, is there too much culture? Without a doubt, the answer would be yes. Is it a bad thing? Yes. Is it a good thing? Yes. So it's to try and separate as quickly as possible and then have a chat together about what we can do about it and how it came about. And this is my feeling. About 4 years ago, I was invited to a film festival in Lisbon, in Portugal. And I was on a panel to talk about the future of film. I always get invited onto these panels. So I was on this panel, and also on the panel it was a much older gentleman who was a film critic, Portuguese film critic. And he said something which really started this train of thought for me, which was, he said, when I was a young man in the 1950s, I was passionate about film, and I went to see, in Lisbon, every art house film I could possibly see, I went to see it. So that my experience of Bergman, of Buñuel, of all the great Italian filmmakers, would be through a single experience of going to the cinema and seeing this particular film. At that time, I would leave the cinema with an absolute certainty that I would probably never, ever see that film again. Because obviously there was no DVD, there was no video, films like that weren't shown on television, and unless there was something like a retrospective or a festival, you wouldn't see a film again. So a film at that point was something you experienced, and then you stored it in your mind, and if you loved it, that memory would grow, and as is our tendency, would be exaggerated, embellished, colors would change, and so on, because film would work exactly the same as our memory of a real experience. So there was this lovely relationship that cinema then had with the person in the audience, which was the event and then the memory of the event. That was the end of the story. I really liked that idea. I liked the idea of, like with live music, you see something and you say to someone 10 years later, "Wow, we weren't you at that gig? It was just incredible. Hendrix was this and blah, blah, blah," and you exaggerate. Yes, he was jamming, he was playing the guitar upside down, and then he set fire to his hair. It was just an incredible event, And you're allowed to do that. And can't really get away with that now because there is so much kind of, let's say, pictorial evidence or sound evidence that, you're talking absolute bullshit. This train of thought coupled with a kind of ever-growing dissatisfaction as a filmmaker about how to find an audience if you want to make something other than a mainstream film, set me off. I think of our cultural world in a very simple way, and forgive the simplicity of this, but I think of it as a lake, something that is being fed by fresh water. You know, sometimes it's a trickle, sometimes it's a torrent. But basically the lake is, is this body of water that then nourishes everything in it and then ultimately does empty, go into the sea, vaporizes, goes up again and comes back again eventually sometime later as this little trickle again. The history of our race and of our culture is very much bound up with this idea that things die. We die. It dies. Paintings ultimately fall apart. And I like that idea. I love the idea that paintings die, that the paint ultimately will fall off. And whatever you do in desperation to try and save it, like with a building collapse, and they go, oh, it's just amazing, there was a mosaic in there, and now it's gone forever. And you go, so what? People saw it. There are now photographs of it. It doesn't really matter. And I started to think, why are we so obsessed with this idea of the preservation of everything? We always have been. But it's only in the last 50 years that the technology has actually developed that has allowed this obsession to become a reality, and that is the problem. I want to talk about the 1950s as being, to me, the significant time in our culture when everything got worse, and better, mainly worse. I'm a musician and I'm a filmmaker. I do other things as well, but those are my main sort of job descriptions. So I want to talk about those aspects of our culture and the 1950s. So let's say the beginning of cinema. It's very, very recent, isn't it? Before that, mankind had striven to come up with devices for recording. And I suppose the two most significant would be the book and music, written music. I mean, to me, it's still far more stunning that Bach wrote down his music in a system that we still use today, and that someone can still play a piece of Bach as he wrote it, but most importantly, with a very specific interpretation. So no two versions of the same piece of Bach are the same. So to me, there's a sort of sublime quality about that kind of recording. I have an idea, here it is, it's a blueprint for something, and off you go, you interpret it. I feel the same way about literature in that a book is a private experience, and because it deals with the inner mind rather than the crude outer mind, which is dominated by the eye, a book is still somehow an experience which is entirely personal. And that's why I would favor radio above television, because it is a medium which deals with the inner part of the brain and the mind rather than the outer part, the obvious part. So we had those systems that had developed, but the nature of humanity is that we want to do more. So the 20th century is very, very interesting, because once you invent electricity and the light bulb and the telephone and all, and suddenly the gramophone record, and initially photography. Now let's take 1 minute to think about photography. This is so interesting because photography comes along and very, very quickly, really quickly, it liberates painting. Just like that. All the painters go, thank God. Thanks a lot, pal. I'm out of here. No more representational portraits of fat capitalists with their dogs. I'm going to do blurry stuff. I'm going to throw paint at the canvas. I'm going to drag a naked model through mine. What are you going to do? Oh, cubism. That sounds good. I'm going to try that as well. Pointillism. Interesting. I don't think it'll last, and so on. They're off. And they're as happy as a pig in mud. And photography then, the poor bastard that it is, becomes the thing that has to now carry the responsibility of representationalism. And of course, some photographers find their own way to kind of express themselves, but pretty much it has taken over. And it's an interesting thing about the way we function and how frightened we are of death, and about the continuity of ourself, and is there a life afterwards, and if there's not, can I at least have a representational photograph to sort of remind people of who I was. So photography then takes on this burden. Very shortly after photography, the movie camera is developed. At first, very, very crude. You have film stock that's not very efficient. You have very cumbersome machinery, metal, basically like a sewing machine. But people manage to record a moving image of fellow human beings. And it's immediately fascinating for everybody. I mean, can you imagine what it was like to see a movie for the first time? And there are stories about a peasant woman in Russia being brought into Moscow to see a film and her screaming when it cut to a close-up because there was no idea of what a close-up could be. She thought someone had had their head chopped off. And I can understand that. And we take it for granted to such an extent now, but try and imagine never having seen a moving film before. In a very short space of time, because at the same time as that's happening, the recording industry has come into being and recordings are being made. At first, incredibly crude, through a horn. The surface of the record is so scratchy that the reproduction is, at best, super impressionistic. But it is a recording. Someone has finally managed to capture something, not in a still. And it's this thing of not in a still that's so vital. Up until the movie and the record, all representation was in single frame, frozen motion. And it was almost like the search, to turn base metal into gold. Suddenly, they managed to do it, and they created a moving image, and then very quickly, they put together the sound and the picture. And at that point, bingo, it then rockets forward, because that was the biggest innovation, I think, of all time. The ability to reproduce the movement and sound of another human being in a lifelike way. Not quite. Think about, let's say, a Louis Armstrong recording. I think of something like Savoy Blues, recorded in 1926. It just happens to be my favorite Louis Armstrong record, but I've heard it on the 78, and it's the most beautiful thing you've ever heard, because the sound of the 78, the quality of the recording, is such that you are listening to not really how it would be to be in a room with Louis Armstrong. You're listening to a poetic piece of sound imagery of Louis Armstrong. You know he was there, he played those notes, and by the time it comes back to us through the scratch and the dirt and the cracks on the record, it's a poem. It's not the real thing. And because of that, I say it's really beautiful. It, to me, is the zenith of the recording industry, the ability to record a poem of someone like that. If you look at film, now that was 1926. Let's jump to 1946 and a film like Notorious, Hitchcock. Although that's relatively a modern film, it still was black and white. The camera lenses were still quite soft. The film stock was not yet fast enough to shoot in low light, so huge amounts of light are being used. So the lighting is very, very stylized and theatrical. And the recording, when you look at that film, is again rather like the Louis Armstrong. It's pretty degraded. It's not a realistic, hi-fi, crisp sound. And thank God, try as they may, digital enhancers across the industry have not managed to make or clean up that film to the extent where it actually just starts to look bad, because the film was not designed to be clean. People were still making films in a kind of impressionistic way. And what goes with that sound and that visual is a certain way of writing, which is very theatrical, very condensed. It's not realistic. We get to the 1950s, and a couple of important innovations conspire to create the mess that we're in now. One is hi-fi, which, the long-playing record, and the ability to record clean sound. And I would cite examples like Frank Sinatra's Songs for Swinging Lovers, Nelson Riddle, recorded at the Capitol Tower in Los Angeles. It's an absolutely magnificent record. It's one of the best things Sinatra ever did. And the recording is absolutely magnificent. And this is recorded in the 1950s. The point I'm trying to make is there is now, between 1950 and now, there is really no discernible improvement in sound quality. It's analog, it's not digital, but everyone would pretty much argue now that analog is warmer and better than digital. But it's a representational recording in a good room and has never been bettered. It's an icon amongst recordings, that record. Then you get suddenly a quick acceleration of the improvement in lenses. They get sharper. Now, sharper means the image is clearer. Film stocks get faster, which means you need less light. However, studios, because they're capitalists and they're actually pretty stupid, continue to use huge amounts of light, so you get clarity suddenly, that more clarity than you'd ever want in your life. So you're getting good sound, and you're getting fantastic picture, and you're getting Technicolor. It's in color, so, oh joy, we now see something that is, let's say, very, very, very representational of what we think we look like, or to put it another way, what we think we'd like to look like, because we now have stars to idealize ourselves as well. Fine, if that was just the end of the story, I wouldn't give a damn. But I've noticed something, and I think it's very significant. 1950s also was the birth of rock and roll. And let's say we can argue that the king of rock and roll is Elvis Presley. One of the most famous actors of that period, one could argue, is Marilyn Monroe, but there's also James Dean, there's Marlon Brando, and any number of other figures that we would now call icons. And they were recorded in the 1950s. And I wonder why, 50 years on, 2007, why when you go to an event of popular culture, let's say, popular music, we're still seeing Elvis Presley. We're still seeing someone singing accompanied by 2 guitars and a bass and drums and a chord structure which is pretty much 3 chords and 12 bars. Now, there's nothing wrong with it. Nothing wrong with rock and roll in its limited way. But 50 years on, they're still wearing the same clothes. They're still singing the same songs, and they're still trying to look like Elvis. Think about it. It's jeans, it's leather jackets. Nothing's changed. Now, let's take 1957, let's say, and go back 50 years. That would be 1907, right? Can you imagine in 1957 the youth wanting to look and sound like somebody from 1907? It's unthinkable, because that seems like the Dark Ages. That's prehistoric, baby. So why? Why suddenly are we stuck in 1957? And I think the reason we are is because we have become the prisoner of this reproductive image of ourselves, and we can't let it go. And so my image of the lake being filled, and sometimes there's a drought and sometimes there's a flood, but the good news is there's always the river that goes out of the lake, goes downhill, and goes into the sea. We basically built a dam round the one that goes out, because we cannot let go, as Dr. Spock would say, of our stuff. It really is a problem. The same guy who spoke at the Portuguese festival with me, talking about that he would never see a film again, and we carried on talking about it, and he said, well, of course, now, if you had a certain budget, you don't even have to be that rich, or at least devious, you could pretty much get every single great film that's ever been made, really without too much difficulty, either on the internet or by going to a few stores. You could build up a record collection of every great jazz record or every great rock record, every classical record. You could do that quite quickly. You could download it free, And so the other thing that's happened is that the art world, let's say loosely the art world to include film and popular culture and everything else, is in a crisis. And the studios are in a crisis, the film studios, because no one is admitting that anything's changed. And they're just continuing. And I would make a sort of very cheap comparison between global warming and global cultural warming, which is that if you continue to pollute the lake and don't empty it, it will die. It will kill everything in it. We live in a culture that still values the iconic. It's the only one in the world. Michelangelo painted this, and there's only one, And of course, as soon as photography came along, that became a huge problem. I was having a dinner one night, and I found myself sitting opposite a curator who deals in contemporary photography. And he with great glee, he was telling the story about these Russian people had come in with apparently a genuine early Russian photograph. And he said, we put it under, we tested it, and straight away saw that it was the wrong kind of paper. And they all went, oh, thank God, how awful. And I said, well, what was the print like? And he said, it was magnificent. And I said, and so, what's the problem? He said, well, it wasn't the original. And I said, it's a bloody photograph. I mean, the idea that you would value the original photograph, which looks like crap, over a better copy of the photograph. If you ask the photographer in 100 years' time, what would you prefer, that they're looking at something that they can hardly see, or would you like a crisp print? I think they'd probably say, I'd like them to see what I shot. But no, because of our art culture, we have to kind of say, oh, no, it's not valuable because it's a multiple image. And that let's say, starting at the high end of that within the art world, and the fact that that is controlled by the most manipulative aspects of capitalism. And I don't want to sound like a nutcase Marxist here or anything, but I don't care if I do, because I think it's such a problem that it's completely destroying our art culture. And let's say in the world of film, it's impossible for a young genius, and they do exist, to produce a film and get it seen by anybody, because there is an absolute state of saturation in the marketplace. You look at a list of the films that are released every week, and they include re-releases, or director's versions, or director's versions, or, anything to put another spin on it. And this is a kind of desperate attempt from the studios, because they know damn well that it's all going to be over quite soon, and this huge pyramid structure is going to collapse. I was in Los Angeles this time last year, and the regime at Paramount had just changed. And it happened to be the day that they threw Tom Cruise off the lot, if you remember, for jumping on the sofa. They decided to kill him, apparently. And so I went on the lot, and they said, you should meet the new people. They're young, they're enthusiastic, they're great. So I parked my car on the lot at Paramount, and second film I ever made, Internal Affairs, was shot there. And I used to have an office there, my own parking space and everything. And so it was weird going back 15, 16 years later. And I walked on, and I was suddenly hit by something I'd forgotten. It's the size of Biddeford. I mean, the Paramount lot is absolutely huge. And I went to meet these people, and they were young and enthusiastic and already a little bit kind of nervous, but they seemed okay. And I just said to them, so what are you going to do? He said, we're really going to try and change things. And I went, what are you going to do? Fire everybody? Because how many people work in this establishment? And who pays the bill? And how do you generate enough money from the crap that you're issuing to pay for all these people? So it's not in their interest or anybody else's interest, like global warming, to stop producing. It is up to us. I mean, I'll conclude and we'll talk about it, but my final heading was, what can we do about it? Well, I think we have to almost ignore that lake and sort of write it off as a lost cause. And hopefully in years, once it realizes that it's dead, it'll officially die. But it's almost like we have at our disposal now enough opportunities and other outlets to start beginning a new kind of alternative cultural world to the one that exists. Because I think the one that exists is over. I really do. It'll stagger on, like global warming, until either Wall Street tells it that it's dead or something like that. But it will certainly never acknowledge it. And in the meantime, culture must go on. We need it. It's an important part of our lives, and we need to safeguard it and create an alternative. That, in a nutshell, is, I think, what was in my notes.
Thank you very much, Mike Figgis. Let me sit down. Before we start sort of knocking this backwards and forwards, let's try and get to grips with this question of this lake, this eutrophied lake of culture that's becoming ever more uninhabitable. Is this really the best metaphor for this? Because you could turn this on its head and say this is a time, and call it a treasure house, that this is a world of riches that anybody can draw on now.
The problem with, I think, human nature is that we do like the iconic, and we don't like the sort of general. So we're constantly searching for the special. We no longer value things the way we did 50 years ago. That has radically changed. I'm convinced of that. And I don't think that's a bad thing, because I think that system was suspect also.
We no longer value things, and yet we don't ever throw them away.
Yes, it's just like in our nature to hang on, but we hang on and we don't particularly value it either, because the more things we have, the less individual value each component has.
So what's the solution to this problem? I mean, one might say that, if you believe this is a pressing problem, then the solution should begin at home, and your back catalogue should go straight into the incinerator. And then we can all look back and think, as we did with that Hendrix gig, I remember leaving Las Vegas. Yeah. Wasn't it great?
It'd be fine with me.
Really?
Really. But I mean,
so if I came down your house with a big box of matches,
it wouldn't be in my house.
We could have a bonfire.
No, you'd have to go to MGM and do it. That's the problem. If only it was at my house, I'd give it away, but it's not. All these films are owned by other people who do as they see fit with it. I don't approve of what they do with it. They're absolutely petrified, of course, now of cloning and of piracy. And, well, they should be. It's almost like the genie is out of the bottle. They created it. and now they can't deal with it.
Have you ever destroyed any material that you've generated yourself?
I destroyed 1,000 tapes about 6 months ago, of dailies from every film I've ever made. Basically because I got a new studio and I was like, okay, shelf space, decisions. Do I just pay for storage? And if I'm looking at my dailies in 20 years' time, I am really the saddest person on the planet,
So how did it feel to destroy those things?
Fantastic.
Liberating.
Absolutely liberating. Let it go. And because the thing is, it's not what you did, it's what you're doing and what you want to do. It's about a forward momentum. And that's what I feel is now stymied, this forward momentum. It's almost we're running on the spot.
But maybe you shouldn't have the authority to make a decision like that. Maybe it's up to us about what goes and what stays. And I'm not sure whether I resent particularly the growth of the archival nature of popular culture. I like the fact that I can watch films that were made long before I was born, and I regret the passing of ones that I discover went to the incinerator and were melted down and used to waterproof aircraft wings.
I wouldn't in any way suggest that the culture police would march in and forcibly take things away and destroy them. It's almost like what I was saying about this thing of being trapped in the 1950s. It is a startling fact that popular music hasn't changed in 50 years, because popular music is supposed to change all the time. And if you think about the 20 years before that, let's say jazz was the kind of, let's say, the home of popular music. In 20 years' time, let's say 1930 to 1950, the amount of change was equal of, in classical music, 300 years. It was on a fast track, and then it just stopped dead.
But one response to the observation that all popular music sounds the same might be, maybe to you, Grandad.
Yeah, I'm just talking about the way it looks. Of course, everybody's an individual, and you can always, as with Bach, do a variation of that cliche. It's just, it looks the same. I find that odd.
But might it not be a good thing that bands have a sense of history, that they might be able to work under the anxiety of influence, as novelists and poets are allowed to do, aren't they? Mm-hmm. And produce something that's better than might have been without that sense of history?
Well, what puzzles me is why a stronger movement hasn't come up and says, screw this. Here's something so much more interesting. Completely different. And of course, in the last 50 years, there have been all kinds of people like Frank Zappa and, very innovative musicians who work within popular music who have done that. But not really in the mainstream hasn't shifted. And my point is that it's trapped there because of the trapping of the image.
But why does the presence, the persistence of the art of dead people retard the progress of living artists? Might there not actually be a kind of healthy competition between the living and the dead?
There should be, and then one of the reasons I agreed to come do this talk was I just thought I'd like to see the debate. I'd like to see what other people think. Am I just becoming cranky? I don't think so,
Well, we can easily find that out, can't we, by opening up to the audience. If you have a question or an observation to make about anything that Mike has said, do stick your hand up. Yes, somebody on the front row.
I think your idea is marvellous, but I wonder if there's a difference between American film, Hollywood, and continental film. I find continental films far more meaningful. I can't watch much Hollywood now. I wonder if that's a difference.
No, I quite agree with that. The problem is, and I didn't really get a chance to go into this because it's such a big subject, is the economics of capitalism, which is that, without a doubt, for the most part, the films that have come out of European art house cinema have been groundbreaking, avant-garde, innovative, and with some examples in America too. The problem is they don't get anything like the distribution worldwide or the acknowledgement, and we are also very much the slave now of these huge mega distribution companies, and pretty much we have to accept what is being given to us. You can't get distribution for an art house film now. You really can't. You can't, aside from institutions like this, or the ICA, or places like that, they do exist, but for the most part, you won't get to see a film like that.
And yet the technology to actually make one is now more accessible than ever before, isn't it?
Absolutely. But the problem is distribution. Maybe it's important for us now to start looking at our audience in a different way. The problem is with cinema, the glamour and the size of it and the ego of it is very much tied into the idea that the world is your audience. And this is absolute bullshit. It's not. In fact, the films you're talking about had an audience and continue to have an audience. And that's, to me, is a magnificent thing. And I think the world now, funnily enough, as we've opened it up through the internet, should fragment into thousands of smaller audiences that have crossover. And that's clearly what's happening on the internet anyway. And if you look at YouTube or something like that, you can start to see that this cross-fertilization is really fantastic, and it's much more interesting. And it's in its infancy right now, and we're talking about very short films. But there is nothing wrong with making a film at a reasonable budget. And the budget's a real problem. You don't need a lot of money to make a film. That's absolute nonsense. But what you need when you've made your lovely little film is to identify who your audience is quite quickly and get it to them. And then if it grows and you find it's got an appeal to a wider audience, that would be great. But your specific audience is actually enough. That's the way it was before. We didn't have global audiences before we had global communication.
Broadly speaking, I agree with what you're saying in terms of information overload. But when you said something about the more things there are, the less we value them, I don't see how that makes sense, because that would be a bit like saying someone who's got 2 children would value them more than someone who's got 6 children. I think people can value, they may have less time to appreciate them, but they can still value a large number of artistic products, for want of a better word.
Yeah, I don't think we fundamentally disagree. I think the point I was making was that within the art world, as an example, because they all interconnect, the art world is built on the idea of one, and it's special, and you can have it at a price, and that price is going to be much higher if there's only one of them. So, for example, contemporary photography has a huge problem in terms of its relationship with the public via the dealer, that criminal that negotiates on their behalf, and takes most of the money. And so you now get photography developing where the photograph has to show how expensive the shoot was. So you get Gursky, or you get people who are basically creating what they call film stills, and you're going to go, wow, that must have cost a fortune to take that photograph. Yes, it did, sir, and it's going to cost you a fortune to buy it. And there's only 3 of them. You're going to go, wait a second, I thought post-Warhol we were going to move into a new era where everybody could have everything, and it wasn't really about the iconic thing, because the iconic thing used to be that, a painter could only paint one painting at a time, and by coincidence it was then a one-off. We don't live in that world anymore, and nor should we. Art should be available, and we should get away from this idea of it's special. It's special to somebody, and everybody can have some of it. I often have an image of Jesus kicking out, the money changers from the temple, and I would just substitute all the famous dealers in the temple as the people being kicked out, because I think that's what's happening. I think they're people who are poisoning it, because them and the studio chiefs, they are basically capitalists, and there's nothing wrong with capitalism when it has a benevolence to it. But in this case, it's mean. It's a mean-spirited capitalism, and it's full of tricks and lies and cons.
Wasn't Hollywood, though, founded by Philistines and con men? Didn't they create the golden age of Hollywood?
Yes.
Harry Cohen, who ran Columbia Studios, was famously a complete foul-mouthed thug. You wouldn't have liked working for him, would you?
No, I would have hated it. But the funny thing the good news about Hollywood was the Second World War, So you suddenly had a lot of very, very, very clever, usually Eastern European Jews or Eastern European intellectuals suddenly needing a job. And the golden age of Hollywood was an accident. It was they were refugees. As it happened, they did really great work while they were there. And the only thing that's changed is it's gone from the highbrow to the lowbrow, catastrophically. And the people who now run Hollywood have no taste at all. But they think because there's money involved and they think of the money as theirs, and my movie made this much money, they think that actually there's a correlation there between profit and taste. So they will say, this is what I like, therefore this is a good thing. I mean, that's the disaster of Hollywood now. But 50 years ago, it was actually quite a healthy place. I know before that it was full of thugs, but it did have its golden age, Mr.
Figgis, I'd like to pick you up on 2 points you've made, and they're important points. One, you seem to be awfully tied up with economics. And 2, I'd like to pick you up over your iconic views. Is it now time that we blow up the Lascaux paintings because they're out of date, we don't longer need them? Because I'm going to say, your icons that you're making now, in 200 years' time, somebody's going to blow your icons off the wall and create new ones. Art doesn't progress. Art is static. Art reflects a particular time and a particular place. You can't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
I think you do have to throw sometimes the baby and the bathwater out. That's what revolution is. Particularly if the baby's dead and the bathwater's poisoned, you know. And I'm not saying, no, there's no cultural police that will destroy something. I love the idea of the slow disintegration of everything that happens, because that's a correct mirror of us. And I love the idea that memory allows us to live on for a while, but not forever. Nothing lasts forever. So I love the idea that a painting slowly falls apart. And there's a beauty in that disintegration. And a really great painting will continue to be beautiful right through its decline. And attempts to spruce it up are rather like people in Beverly Hills who dress like they're 18, look strangely like they're 18, but in fact are 93, you know. There's something odd about it. Like, why wouldn't you want to enjoy your natural process? You know, well, the answer is because you live in a culture that is so obsessed with 18, because those are the people who are buying the crap that you're making, that you feel you have to look like the people who are the victims of your own delusions, you know. So I don't know if we disagree. I don't believe in destroying. I'm just saying if you pull the plug out, there will be a natural thing anyway, which is the lake should be emptying.
You spoke briefly about YouTube as possibly being a platform where young filmmakers could find their voice. But if it's taken that YouTube works on a merit system, if you view the 100 most viewed or top-rated videos or pieces of media on there, I think it's fair to say that they appeal to the low end. It's sort of a bottom-up idea of the audience. So how would you actually envisage that works of groundbreaking cultural merit will be able to rise through YouTube?
Well, I use YouTube as an example. And the interesting thing about YouTube is that you can find it quite simply just by typing something in. And it may be through word of mouth, through somebody else that you know. And that does seem to be how it works. And I really like that idea of, you know, a much bigger version just of word of mouth and of networking. In any culture, the most viewed, the most popular will be the lowest common denominator. And they tend to be funny things and sort of jokey things, and that's fine. But at least a system exists where very, very easily, just through using your fingers and typing, you can find something else. The other day, I did get hooked because I started to find all these clips of musicians I didn't even know existed. Live footage of Charlie Parker, footage of Miles Davis. I'd never even heard of this footage, and it's absolutely gorgeous, you know.
So that sounds more like the treasure house than the dead lake to me.
Absolutely. The dead lake is a sort of a provocative idea of, you know, to examine why we do something. Because sometimes if you understand why it's happening, it's much easier to kind of go, oh, right, and move away from it.
And what do you think the consequences of it will be? Are you envisaging some kind of cultural crash, like, you might have some kind of environmental or economic crash?
I think without a doubt. The film...
And what form would that take, then?
Well, let's take film. The film industry will crash, for sure, under the weight of piracy, under the weight of economics. It cannot sustain the lavish economic lifestyle that it enjoys right now. You know, when you go to Hollywood and suggest you can make a film on a small camera, it's like you are the devil. They would basically take you out and lynch you, you know, because you're full stop. You're threatening their livelihood, their swimming pool, their 2 cars, their nice house, their second house, their lifestyle. You know, they don't give a damn about filmmaking. It's a great lifestyle.
What are you doing to prepare for this crash?
I'm just carrying on. For some years, you know, I had my period in Hollywood, and I learnt a lot. And the only successful film I ever made there was made with French money outside of the Hollywood system, and was a big success, which impressed no one in Hollywood in terms of, you know, like, oh, that's an aberration. It's not something we could take seriously, you know. So I'm just getting on with what I do, and then trying to put people together, writing a book to suggest how you can help yourself. I do workshops, and in those workshops, I try and teach people how to make films, but I also try and teach them how to get things going.
But have these conditions made you think more carefully about the kinds of work that you do?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know,
So what do you take into consideration now that you maybe didn't a decade ago?
money, a big important issue, which is don't spend too much of it if it's unrealistic. And, you know, always, what's the bottom line? How much money? I go back to a Goddard statement. The best thing ever said about filmmaking. He said, show me the budget, and I'll show you the script. Meaning, how much money have I got? I'll work out how many extras I can have, how much shopping I can do. That's the most important thing. Don't say, here's my script, the Red Sea parts, can I have some money? Because that's unrealistic. The best dramas are the ones about people. They're not about the Red Sea parting, and they're not about World War X. They really are about usually very simple human conditions. And it's the same story over and over and over again, rather like the rock band, but with a different take on it.
Well, with the future in mind, let's throw this back out to the audience and see if you have any observations, hopes or fears about the future of culture.
Isn't part of the problem that too much culture is confined to the cultural cathedrals rather than being out on the street? It's rather like toothpaste. It's no good until it comes out the tube. You know, it's not confined to theatre or to filmmaking. The new pictures, as it were, will come when all those different cultural disciplines are reset. And that might happen in a pub.
There should be no rule about where it takes place. And I'd be the first person to say get rid of what we think of as a cinema, because all it is a room with the chairs pointing in the same direction. Why does it have to be a cinema? It can, these days, with a portable projector, it could be anywhere. You know, as long as you had a blackout, and as I say, everyone more or less facing the front. Music, the same thing. There is no reason why we need to. It's just convenient, isn't it, to have a venue because it's recognizable, it's a sort of generic quality and all the rest of it. Usually the best stuff, most innovative stuff, initially takes place outside of those, what you call cathedrals, I think. And it should continue that way.
We've got time for one more quick one.
It was about what you were saying about how people in 1957 seem to appear as people in 1907. I'm just mindful of what Virginia Woolf said when she said in 1940, on or about 1914, everything changed. And I wonder whether, in fact, we are waiting for kind of like some major change. You know, and I rather think it's a bad one, actually.
Of course, conveniently we had World War I, and then very shortly afterwards we had World War II, and there was such a kind of linked with such technological innovation and change that inevitably the speed of change was phenomenal in everything, in architecture, technology, and the arts. Of course, they're all linked. It's now been 60-something years since the Second World War, and we've had our external skirmishes and Iraq and all the rest of it, but we haven't had anything on the same scale as a world war. Thank God. I mean, it would be terrible if you think we need another war because culture is really stagnating here.
Well, are you looking forward to this crash? This is what I want to know. You're anticipating this.
Yeah, because it'll be good. It'll be great. It'll be fun, and people will be thinking in a different way. Because when culture changes, I mean, we're in Liverpool, the effect of the Beatles, you know, in the 60s, I mean, was and then on the country, and then on the Western world in general, was absolutely mind-blowing. And there's nothing like that happening. That affected everything else. That affected cinema, it affected British cinema, it affected poetry, it affected everything. Yeah, bring it on.
It's time to bring this particular act of cultural production to an end, and all it remains for us to do is to show our appreciation to Mike Figgis. Thanks very much indeed, Mike.